We'd only been gone 3 days, just a short family trip, an attempt to escape the daily grind between my work, Letitia's schoolwork, and the chaos we'd long since stopped noticing, as if we'd become accustomed to breathing in the noise and fatigue. By the time our little car pulled up to my parents' house, it resembled a jumbled mess of memories. Cookie wrappers rustled under the seats, empty juice boxes rolled across the floor, and the sweet smell of spilled compote drifted from the trunk. Letitia, my 7-year-old chatterbox with an invariable thirst for order and chaos, sat in the back seat, keeping her important list, a veritable inventory of the things she missed about home, a cat-shaped nightlight, her soft blanket with little bunnies, her own pillow, smelling of something elusively childish, warm and simple, like vanilla and sunshine. She read this list aloud, as if bringing small, familiar joys back to life, and I smiled, thinking how wonderful it would be to simply walk in, leave my things by the door, and let her run into her room without taking off her shoes, to a place where everything is in its place, where the air smells of peace and childhood, simply normal, simply easy. And before we continue, I want to thank you. I'm so glad you're watching this video on my channel. Please write in the comments if you hear stories like these. Do you remember someone from your life? Maybe yourself, someone close, or just a moment when everything suddenly changed. Write the first thing that came to mind. The house stood in the same calm silence as I'd left it. The light was on the porch, the thick curtains blocked out even a glimmer of the evening sky, and all this neatness seemed to whisper, everything is under control here. Only I, tired and satisfied with the journey, didn't detect any anxiety in this impeccable silence. Mom opened the door before I could knock, and her smile struck me as deliberately celebratory, as if we'd arrived not from the road but to a prearranged reception. Dad stood behind her, arms folded. He tried to smile, but his lips barely moved, and his eyes remained wary. Behind them, leaning against the doorframe, stood my sister Noemi, her ever-present mug of coffee, and a little further down, in the dim hallway, loomed her husband Diego, looking like a man who'd witnessed something he didn't want to discuss. I immediately found it odd that they were all there, as if they'd gathered in advance, as if they'd been expecting us not just to come home but to some kind of family gathering where matters that make everyone uncomfortable are decided. Usually, when we returned, Mom would shout from the kitchen, "Take off your shoes. Just don't trample the floor." Dad asked if I'd remembered to fill the car with gas, and everything went on as usual, with love hidden in reproaches and trivialities. "Welcome home," Mom said too cheerfully, and that welcome made something flutter in my chest. "You must be tired," I answered quietly. "We'll just drop off our things and put Letitia to bed." My daughter had already jumped out of the car, dragging her pink suitcase, and, laughing, rushed into the hallway, as if eager to return to her own world, where everything was as before. And then, at the very second she disappeared through the door, I noticed the 4 adults exchange a glance, a brief, meaningful glance, laced with awkwardness and uncertainty, as if someone was about to say something no one wanted to say. Mom cleared her throat, and her voice took on a strained softness, the same one she always used when delivering bad news. "Sweetheart," she said, "before she runs off, we need to tell you something." My stomach tightened. Should I tell her? What should I say? Dad cleared his throat and stepped forward, as if shielding Mom, and said, "It's just temporary." Noemi smiled, trying to lighten the mood, but it came out false. "Don't make anything weird out of it, okay?" Her voice trembled. "It's just while you were gone, we had to rearrange a few things." "Rearrange what?" I asked, the words catching in my throat. Mom took a deep breath, looked down, as if gathering her courage, and said something that momentarily held the air between us. "We turned her room into a storage room, darling. It's only for a little while." I felt something hot and scorching rush out of my chest, but I couldn't utter a word. The hallway had grown stuffy. Letitia, hearing it, stopped mid-stride, clutching a stuffed bunny. "What?" she asked quietly. Mom smiled, that forced smile they use at failed family gatherings. "It's temporary, honey. You'll be sleeping with Mom. We've got a great mattress, very comfortable." She spoke too quickly, as if afraid her words would freeze. "It's just until we figure this all out," Dad interjected, not looking at me. "A couple of months tops." Noemi sipped her coffee and shrugged. My boys needed a room for school projects, she said defensively, so we had to rearrange the space a bit. Diego nodded, confident in the rationality of his own decision. It was the most sensible. I looked down the hallway, and time seemed frozen. The light from the kitchen fell in a long streak, resting against Letizia's closed door, and there was something almost insulting about this silent obstacle. The doorknob gleamed with new, foreign metal, and next to it sat 3 enormous trash bags and a cardboard box with a single word written on the lid in my mother's neat, painfully familiar handwriting. Letitia, I heard my voice. Even in too quiet, as if it weren't mine, you packed her room. My mother waved it away as if it were a pesky fly. Just some things, she said. We didn't want her tripping over the boxes. Boxes? I repeated, feeling the anger in my chest thicken, turning into something heavy and viscous. What boxes, Mom? She sighed, adjusted her robe, and said with the tired firmness that usually ends family arguments, just storage space. Don't start, Anna, it's too late. Noemi laughed softly, that short, condescending laugh of hers that had made me feel stupid since childhood. You're so dramatic, she said, looking at me over her mug, and I realized she had no intention of apologizing. Letitia looked at me, her eyes glittering in the dim light, and whispered, without taking her eyes off the door, why can't I come in? No one answered, they simply stood there, waiting for me to soften the situation, to nod, to smile, to pretend it was all a small thing, because it was so convenient. If one woman swallowed her grudge, everyone else would feel better, but I didn't. That night, the promised very comfortable mattress turned out to be a thin layer on the cold floor, and when I unfolded the sheet, it made an unnatural crackling sound, as if mocking me. I told Letitia she could have the bed, but she stubbornly shook her head, arguing for only half a minute, and then her eyelids began to droop, and soon she was asleep, curled up around her teddy bear, burying her face in the fur. As if shutting out the world, I lay down next to her, on a pillow that smelled of cleaning solution and something foreign, and watched for a long time as the old ceiling fan slowly rotated, its propellers rattling, as if beating out the rhythm of thoughts. I thought about how many times my family had broken the same rule over and over again, never touch what doesn't belong to you, but, of course, with us, this rule was always flexible. They touched, took, rearranged, explaining everything as caring. A thick, sticky silence reigned in the house, devoid of the hum of the television, the familiar clinking of the dishwasher, or even the occasional sighs of the walls. It wasn't peaceful silence, not rest, but a strange sign, the silence of pride, the silence of people certain they'd done the right thing. I waited until Letitia's breathing became even, then sat up carefully, trying not to creak the floorboards, and saw a light flash in the hallway. The door to her room stood at the end, as if peering at me, and in that gaze there was a challenge and a mystery. I went over and tried the handle. It was locked. The air smelled of paint, fresh wood, and the faint scent of new fabrics. This wasn't a storage room, this was something else, something new, something that had already displaced us. A floorboard creaked behind me, and I turned to see my mother standing in the gloom, her arms crossed over her chest, wrapped in a robe, as if protecting herself from me. Anna, she said softly but forcefully, it's late, it's time for you to go to bed. I just wanted to see what you put in there, I replied, feeling a lump growing in my chest. It's all ready, she said, avoiding my gaze. Let's not make a scene, okay? And she turned and walked back, quietly humming the same lullaby she once sang to me when I was afraid of the dark. I stood alone, staring at the closed door until my eyes began to water from exhaustion. The lock gleamed in the lamplight, predatory, cold, with a kind of smug gleam, as if it were rejoicing in its new purpose, keeping my daughter and me on the other side. I told myself to let it go, that it was all stupid, that there was no point in stirring it up, but the longer I stood there, the heavier the air became, as if the house itself was holding its breath, watching me. Finally, I turned away. The floor was harder than I remembered, and my body, unaccustomed to such nights, immediately reminded me I was no longer 20. I lay there, feeling every bone know its place and ache with resentment along with me. Letitia slept peacefully, clutching her teddy bear, as if holding on to the only thing that hadn't changed. That was what mattered, her sleep, her breathing, her peace. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the house whisper, crackle, and breathe beyond the walls, waiting for everything to return to normal, but it never did. When you grow up in a house where silence replaces conversation, over time you begin to understand. It's not peace, it's a sentence, it's the sound of people deciding what to do with you. I thought for a long time about how naive I had been to believe that distance could fix anything, that if you travel far enough, get your own mail, your own bills, and your own iron, the ghosts of childhood will be left behind. But no, it turns out they can forward their mail. As a child, I was always different, as my mother said, without judgment, but with a hint of weariness. The surprise of a child that came too late. Noemi came first, polished like a shop window, gleaming with achievement. The pride of the family, on whose shoulders they hung there. We did everything right, and then I came, not according to plan, an afterthought, an accidental continuation that no one needed but that couldn't be erased. She was always the best, the leader, the example, the one who set the tone, and I was simply there, too loud, too sensitive, too not her. If I spoke, I was dramatic, if I was silent, sullen. And maybe that's why the door with the new lock felt not just locked to me, but honest. My mother once casually said, without looking at me, I probably sucked all the energy out of the room, and I, a 10-year-old girl, didn't understand what it meant, but on some instinctive level I sensed it wasn't a joke, but a confession best left undiscussed. After all, if my mother admits to sucking air out of me, what's left for me to do? Frankly, for a 10-year-old, it's a damn unpleasant thought, to know you live next to someone who has made himself the center of the universe. Over time, I learned to survive. And survival in our family was the art of compromise. Don't be too outgoing, lest you irritate Noemi. Don't be too quiet, lest you arouse suspicion. Don't be too smart, lest you sound brash. And don't be too stupid, lest you evoke pity. I learned this instinctively, to be somewhere in between, not to interfere, not to demand, not to expect applause. Noemi, of course, lived differently. She had the kind of wedding girls dream of, with a designer dress, a cloud-like train, and photos that could be printed on greeting cards. Everything sparkled, everything was in its place, white roses, crystal glasses, Dad wearing a tie for the first time in years, Mom beaming as if she were the one getting married, and I just ran away. It wasn't a rebellion, it was logistics. I simply couldn't breathe under those white ribbons and fake smiles. My marriage, if you can call it that, was different. A courthouse, someone else's dress bought on sale, a husband-in-law with a camera who forgot to turn on the flash, and a quiet yes, said with the hope that maybe now everything would be easier. He wasn't a bad man, my husband, just one of those people who believe that seatbelts are for panickers and luck is a family trait, like eye color. When the accident happened, his luck finally ran out. He died before the ambulance arrived, and Letitia, my little girl, sat in the back seat, a broken leg, a body covered in bruises, and those nightmares that would later live long in her dreams and in my chest. She recovered slowly, so slowly that I sometimes caught myself thinking, maybe she was simply learning to believe again that the world wasn't collapsing at any moment. Children have an amazing ability to recover. The body copes, but the bills don't disappear. They multiplied like rabbits, piling up in stacks, jumping from drawer to table, from refrigerator to dresser. The insurance covered only what was beneficial to her, not us, and so I worked, and kept working. During the day, it was the office, the phone calls, the spreadsheets, the fluorescent lights that made my skin turn gray. At night, cleaning those same offices, only for a different salary, and the same desks, only now I was wiping up the stains of other people's lunches. Even getting 5 hours of sleep felt like a victory. If exhaustion were an Olympic sport, I probably would have been on the podium long ago. Moving in with my parents wasn't a romantic decision, it wasn't a new chapter, it was arithmetic, simple, ruthless, rent versus therapy, and guess which was more expensive? When I called my mom, she sounded like I'd given her a gift. How wonderful it will be to have a full house again, she said, and I immediately understood the translation, free labor, whose name could be added to a shopping list. I still insisted on paying them at least a little rent, a rent they called symbolic. Symbolic. Of what? My dependence? My fault? But Noemi and Diego live here, just in a different part of the house, and, as Mom said, help her with the housework. Apparently, helping Mom is a special currency they use to pay for everything. Noemi likes to say, we're all family, so that makes everyone equal. It's funny how the word equality always skews toward her. After the accident, people called Letitia brave. They said she was lucky, that we were both lucky. They said it with that sympathetic glint in their eyes that really meant, It's good she wasn't with us. They didn't see the hospital corridors, the smell of antiseptic, the dim light in which each night seemed like an eternity. They didn't hear the cries of pain when a 7-year-old is being taught to walk again. They didn't know how I stood at the checkout, choosing between groceries and paying for physical therapy, how I cried in the car because I couldn't do it at home. She might wake up at home, and yes, when mom now says, "Everything's fine, Anna, the kids are getting better," I want to hand her a folder of receipts, prescriptions, and statements and say, "Look, this is what's good." When dad mutters that I'm exaggerating, that it's not that bad, I want to ask if he's ever noticed how his youngest daughter is drowning in debt right under his roof, but I remain silent. I always remain silent. I pay my dues, leave for work on time, return when Letitia is already asleep, and take her to her scheduled doctor's appointments, as if life itself had become a schedule. And then Aunt Lillian died, Mom's older sister, who was almost 80. She lived alone in an old brick house surrounded by rose bushes that no one dared trim because, as Mom used to say, they remember Lillian's own hands. My aunt was the kind of woman who sends cards well in advance, always a week ahead of time, and never forgets your favorite dessert. We weren't particularly close, but she adored Letitia, giving her antique trinkets, music boxes smelling of dust and jasmine, and once said, "Looking at my little girl, she reminds me of myself," and in that moment, for the first time, I understood that memory isn't something we choose to preserve, but something that clings to us even when we try to escape. The funeral was surprisingly quiet, almost silent, as if death itself had asked us not to disturb its peace. People arrived slowly, with the cautious steps one takes in a hospital corridor, not out of respect, but out of fear of disturbing something fragile and invisible. Mom cried only as long as was appropriate, her tears like measured drops from a faulty faucet. They flowed on schedule, so she could later say, "Yes, I cried, of course." Noemi got the microphone. "Who else?" She spoke softly, beautifully, as always, pausing skillfully, as if she'd rehearsed each word in front of a mirror. The words rang true, but there was no warmth or pain within them, only a theatrical echo. I stood to the side and thought that Aunt Lillian, if she could see it, would have chuckled. She wouldn't have liked all this slicked-down grief. Later, when everyone had moved on to the casserole and artificial conversations, where sympathy sounded as strained as cheap strings, I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, "What will happen to Lillian's house?" Mom, without blinking, responded in a tone that suggested she'd already prepared the words, "Oh, there are some debts left, just a little. The lawyers are already sorting it out." Dad nodded along, like a backup singer who's been denied a solo for ages. Noemi shrugged, like someone who's long understood everything. That house needed too much work anyway, and Mom, deftly, as if she'd rehearsed it, immediately steered the conversation toward gas prices, politics, anything to avoid talking about the rose bushes that Auntie wouldn't let anyone touch. But that didn't work for me. I knew Lillian. She wasn't extravagant, didn't wear jewelry, lived modestly but with dignity, and her house, old, with soft light in the windows, smelling of rose attar and paper, never seemed a burden. She never mentioned debt, not once, and if there had been, I'm sure she would have said to me, at least casually, in her quiet voice, "You know, Anna, times are hard these days," but she didn't, so it wasn't true, or at least someone wanted me to believe it. I told myself I was probably just exaggerating, that Mom had everything under control. Noemi had her own worries, and I was always looking for the catch. But denial in our family isn't just a habit, it's a talent, an almost innate gift. We all know how to pretend everything is fine. Mom, politely and with a smile. Dad was silent, his gaze lowered. Noemi was confident, loud, gesturing as if affirming her own reality with her hands, and I was too, only more quietly. That night, I couldn't sleep for a long time. The floor ached, as if it remembered the footsteps of everyone who had once walked on it, and a persistent image lingered in my mind, that same lock at the end of the hallway that Mom had mentioned, saying it needs to be changed when I have the strength. The house was asleep, but that lock seemed to glow inside me, like an aching tooth that keeps returning to my attention. I tried not to think, commanded myself to sleep, but it didn't work. At some point, the old clock in the hallway clicked loudly, decisively, as if giving me permission to act. I sat up, felt for my phone by the mattress, and turned on the flashlight. White light burst into the darkness, brushing the edge of Letitia's brace. She stirred slightly, but didn't wake up. I exhaled with relief, threw back the blanket, and stood up. The floor creaked beneath my feet, as if protesting, but I moved forward, stepping carefully, trying not to breathe louder than the silence. The hallway was colder than expected, and there was something ominous, unnatural about the cold, as if the walls were holding their breath. I turned the light down so as not to blind myself and moved toward the stairs. The motion sensor blinked red but didn't turn on, a small miracle, a sign that I should continue. The kitchen smelled of lemon juice and the remains of last night's dinner. I opened the refrigerator, just to make some noise that would explain my presence if anyone woke up. And then I noticed that very shelf near the laundry room. Everything on it was just as I remembered: a wicker basket with a lid, a cracked vase, a yellowed list of phone numbers on a magnet, and that very spot where my father's spare keys had been lying since the 90s. My hand moved there on its own, before I could think. Under my fingers, sticky tape, cool metal. A key that somehow felt new. It was clean and shiny, as if it had just been made, and this immediately made me wary. I walked back upstairs slowly, as if walking on water. The light from my phone flickered in time with my heart, and the air in the hallway grew thicker. Letitia's door gleamed at the end, white paint, a handle familiar from childhood, and I paused for a moment, feeling a strange, sticky feeling of guilt growing. I knew that opening someone else's door at night was wrong, even if it was a child's door, even if it was your child, but something inside me demanded to see. I inserted the key. The click was almost silent, but it echoed inside me like a gunshot. The door opened slightly, and I picked up the phone. A thin, sharp beam of light cut through the darkness, slowly gliding across the room. Everything was in place: the toys, the bed, the chair by the window. Only the air was different. Dust-covered moths danced in the light, and there was something wrong, too alive, about their dance. It smelled not of a child's room, not of sleep, not of toys, but of polish, freshness, cleanliness, as if someone had recently thoroughly washed everything here, scrubbed it until it sparkled, erasing every memory. And in that glow, I felt an icy suspicion, as if the home I'd known since childhood had begun to hold on to something of its own from me. The warehouse turned out to be less of a warehouse than a carefully planned showroom, in which every item stood in its place as neatly as if someone had just finished a rehearsal for a reception. Tall cabinets lined the walls, their lacquered surfaces reflecting the light like a mirror in a house long unoccupied. A folded throw blanket lay on a velvet chair, warm and cozy, the kind Aunt Lillian always draped over her shoulders when she sat by the window with a book. Paintings leaned against the walls, lined up in rows, like guests waiting to be invited to the table, and neat boxes, labeled and identical, all too familiar handwriting, stood in neat rows, as if they were not mementos but accounting records. Everything gleamed, not a speck of dust, not a stain. Even the air was saturated with polish, as if someone wanted the place to smell not of home, but of a gallery. I walked closer and shone the light on one of the cabinets, and then my heart stumbled. A tag hung from the handle, thick, cardboard, with the words written in neat handwriting: Estate of Lillian V. I froze, and the light wavered in my hand. I stepped to the next cabinet, then another. Tags were everywhere. Each item had its own nameplate, its own label, its own little paper life. I didn't need to guess. I knew this furniture the way I know the wrinkles on my own palms. I'd seen this carved vanity when I'd visited Aunt Lillian in the summer, when Letitia was still a baby, and we'd drink lemonade from thick glass tumblers, and Aunt Lillian would tell stories about the family heirlooms, as if each one held a secret. I remembered that table, with its walnut inlays, faintly scented with cedar, and the jewelry box my aunt always kept there, like a shrine. I even recognized the piano stool, the one whose corner had broken off when Letitia, then a toddler, had twisted the seat too hard. Everything was there: Aunt Lillian's entire house, moved, packed, displayed like a museum. Something sharp, almost physical, stabbed me beneath the ribs. I took a step back, feeling a heavy, viscous breath begin to rise in my chest. The key in my hand was warm, as if it still held the warmth of the lock, and with it, some strange, electrical commotion. For a few seconds, I simply stood there, motionless, trying to breathe quietly enough to hear my own thoughts. Why did they hide all this? Why lock the room if it was just stuff? Why lie? If this really was a warehouse, why didn't they tell me it all belonged to Aunt Lillian? I tried to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation. Perhaps a lawyer had advised me to temporarily move the property here until the inheritance paperwork was sorted out. Perhaps the furniture was being cleaned for an appraisal. Perhaps it was simply a temporary measure, nothing more, but the more I played with these theories, the more false they sounded, like a poorly executed line. I knew my parents, they loved to talk about honesty and openness, but only until the conversation turned to money. Money in our family was like a ghost, everyone knew it was there, but no one spoke its name. I felt a chain of thoughts begin to form within me, and the end of it already glowed with something unpleasant. If there was a reason, it had to remain on paper. In this house, nothing was done without paper. We kept everything in folders, envelopes, files, taxes, insurance, bills, receipts for a 20-year-old carpet. Everything was there. If you need anything, look in the closet, Mom always said, so the answer had to be there. I stood at the top of the stairs, holding myself to the banister, and I could almost hear myself thinking, Anna, don't do this, go to bed, everything will be explained. But that room kept flashing before my eyes, spotlessly clean, locked like a museum, and those labels, neat, identical, treacherously even. I knew I wouldn't rest. I approached my parents' study. The door was ajar, and the soft creak of the hinge seemed like a whisper to me. That study always smelled of something old-fashioned, a mixture of paper, ink, and self-importance. Here, Dad read the newspapers, and Mom sat with a cup of tea, going over the bills. I dimmed the phone light to avoid being blinded and walked over to the large oak cabinet against the wall. Each drawer was neatly labeled in my mother's handwriting, even as her breath: taxes, insurance, property, inheritance. I opened one of the drawers, and the scent of time wafted inside. The folders were stacked tightly, each with a paper tab. I leafed through them, trying not to rustle loudly, until my gaze fell on a familiar name, Lillian V. Just a name, no explanation. That simple combination of letters made my stomach clench. I pulled the folder out, set it on the table, placed a mug next to it, and leaned the phone against it so the light fell softly. Inside were letters, neatly folded documents, stamped pages, signed papers where each line seemed to exude something legal and cold. I turned the first page, and my blood ran cold. The first thing I noticed was the bolded words: beneficiary, Leticia Esposito, trustee, Margaret Esposito. It took me a moment to grasp the meaning. My name wasn't listed anywhere, just my daughter's, and my mother's. I read it over and over, as if the letters could possibly be arranged differently. Maybe it was just a trust, a gift, something innocuous, like the college savings my aunt had once set up for Leticia. The next page killed all hope. I turned over page after page, and the words cut like a knife through the living: a complete inventory of the property, the house, the furniture, the savings account, and everything else. Every word written in my daughter's name, and the second I read it, the breath caught in me and the world around me narrowed to the paper in my hands, to the handwriting and seals that did not allow me to think any more about the mistake that simply did not exist. I sat there, peering at the letters, looking for a typo, a sign that this was some kind of mistake, that Aunt Lillian was being senile, that the heirs had messed things up as usual, but nothing jumped out. No saving grace: the will, the trust documents, the appraisal forms, all neatly stapled, the printed email from the real estate agent marked offer accepted, pending inspection. And in that string of words there was not a simple misunderstanding, but a plan in which they were already acting and selling what belonged to Lillian while I was apparently preoccupied with matters that seemed important at the time. At first, I simply sat and listened to my own pulse, which pounded in my ears louder than any noise. Then instinct took over. I grabbed the phone, photographed a page, another, close-ups, signatures, edges, stamps. The sound of the shutter echoed off the oak walls of the office so loudly that I wanted to whisper forgiveness to the silence, and maybe even to Lillian herself, for stealing evidence from paper. I carefully put everything back, closed the folder, and pushed the drawer shut. As if this simple gesture would make it less real, the house was still silent. Only a storm had raged in my head, and a single line still flickered on the phone screen: beneficiary, Leticia Esposito. I didn't know what to call the feeling. Shock didn't seem like a blunt enough word, anger too narrow, and disbelief had transformed into something heavier, thicker, and colder, slowly spreading through my veins, making every movement difficult. I turned off the phone light, stepped out into the hallway, and locked the office door behind me, as if I were locking not the room but the very possibility that it might remain invisible. Passing Letitia's door, I touched the handle for a moment to feel its familiar temperature, and then walked back to the mattress on the floor. I sat with the phone on my lap, the photographs staring back at me like little windows, demanding an answer, whatever this was, whatever they were planning. It couldn't just be a misunderstanding anymore. When dawn stretched through the curtains like a thin ribbon, and the house, strangely enough, did not become any lighter, I already knew what I would do. I drove Letitia to school, smiling and pretending that nothing terrible had happened, and she, believing children, waved at me from the car window, completely trusting me, because children sincerely believe that adults can fix everything. I wasn't sure I could fix it, but I decided to try, because staying in the chair and watching as other people's hands sold off my memory was more impossible than rushing into battle. The lawyer's office was quieter than I'd expected, that peculiar moneyed silence where even anger makes you speak in a hushed voice, and it was the very same man whose name I'd seen on Aunt Lillian's papers, the same notary consultant who'd signed the trusts, who only looked up when I'd given my name, his gaze penetrating yet cold. I told him I'd found some documents, not telling him I'd found them in a locked room where my 7-year-old daughter used to sleep, because at that moment, anything I said seemed at least one notch short of the truth, and I didn't want a shadow of surprise I wasn't ready to share crossed his face. He took my phone carefully, as if I'd handed him not a harmless screen but something alive, capable of biting, and after scrolling through the first photo, he froze, unblinking, as if trying to estimate exactly how many layers of trouble he'd just seen. Then he took off his glasses and wiped them with the corner of his handkerchief. Though there wasn't a speck of dust in it, he simply needed a few seconds to find the words. "These are copies of the original trust documents," he said carefully, with that note that suggests not doubt but inevitability. I realized he was testing my reaction, wanting to make sure I understood. "This wasn't a fake, so it's real," he added, without looking at me. I nodded, feeling my throat dry and my tongue go soft. "It's very real. The assets were placed in trust for your daughter. Your mother is listed as the trustee." I managed a short, "Yes, she trusts herself very much." He frowned and leaned back slightly, pressing his pen to the table. "You didn't know anything about this, did you?" I told him everything as briefly as I could, without going into detail, but also without attempting to justify myself. A few sentences were enough for him to turn pale and put his pen away, as if it no longer held any meaning. "I'll need to contact the authorities," he said after a short pause, not looking at me, as if staring into space. "Do you want to file a report yourself or would you prefer me to?" he asked. "The less time they have to invent another story, the better," I replied, and he nodded. A moment later, his fingers were dialing a number, and I heard short, businesslike phrases: address, names, confirmation of facts. By midday, I was sitting in a stuffy police station with plastic chairs and the smell of stale coffee, clutching a paper cup and watching as an officer, a man with tired eyes, scrolled through my photos on a screen. He frowned, occasionally freezing the frame, zooming in on the signature, then zooming out again, and occasionally glancing at me, not suspiciously, but rather with the expression people have when they see someone who's revealed too much truth at once. "And then they killed someone," he said strangely, halfway between a statement and a test. I remained silent. He sighed. "So, apparently, this was your daughter's inheritance, and apparently, your parents sold it." He wrote something down in his notebook, muttering under his breath. "You have clear evidence of concealment of inherited property. These materials will be forwarded to the Financial Crimes Unit." He looked at me, "The big unit." I couldn't help but ask, "Do they offer discounts for families?" He didn't laugh. "They took the statement, made copies of all the files, and then promised to send officers that afternoon." By the time I left the station, the sun was already hurting my eyes, and my phone was vibrating in my pocket. The screen showed unknown number. I answered. The lawyer's voice was calm but quick. "They're already on their way. Don't go there alone." I chuckled into the phone. I wouldn't dream of it, but I did dream of it. I simply didn't know any other way. The patrol car beat me to it. 2 officers in neat uniforms stood in the driveway, one holding a clipboard, the other a notepad. The lawyer stood next to them, still calm, as if he were rehearsing. His hands, holding the papers, trembled slightly. My parents' cars, of course, were still parked there, washed, well-maintained, shiny, as if their lives were on schedule. I arrived just as the officers rang the doorbell. It opened, and there they all were: Mom, Dad, Noemi, Diego, like a bad family portrait, where everyone is trying to look proper. Mom was smiling, but her lips were trembling. "Anna, what does all this mean?" she asked, her voice breaking before the senior officer raised his badge and said, "We need to ask a few questions about property belonging to Lillian V." Mom's face changed, as if someone had turned off a light inside her. "Did you call the police?" she whispered, then louder, almost shouting. The officer blinked. "Madam, this isn't." But she didn't let him finish, jabbing a finger at me. "She's trying to destroy this family." Dad stepped toward her, trying to grab her elbow, but she pushed him away. Noemi stepped forward, mug in hand as always, in her robe, as if caught in the rehearsal of a domestic tragedy. "Anna, you're exaggerating," she said, as if talking to a petulant child. "Really? Hiding legal documents in a locked room, am I exaggerating?" I replied. Diego, standing off to the side, muttered, "She's making a scene." I turned to him, then stopped telling me that. The silence grew taut. The police began photographing the furniture, the boxes, the tags on every item. Flashes of light flickered, reflecting off the lacquered surfaces, off the polished corners of the tables, as if each frame confirmed the mystery. Mom stood motionless, but I could see her fingers trembling. Dad muttered something about misunderstandings, but even his voice now sounded off-key, like a bad recording of an old record. When the officers finally finished their endless photos, notes, and signatures, one of them, a tall man with thick eyebrows and a tired voice, said calmly, as if he were announcing the weather, "We'll pass this on to the district attorney's office. You'll all be contacted." His mother looked at him as if she were about to bite, as if her personal insult had suddenly taken on substance. "You don't understand, this is a family matter," she said with cold fury, swallowing the words like poison. The young officer, who had obviously heard this hundreds of times, replied without blinking, "That's what everyone says before it becomes a crime." His words hung in the air like a door no one had closed. When the police left, the house was filled with silence, viscous, heavy, like smoke after a fire. Mom was the first to break it. She turned to me, her voice shaking with indignation, fear, something she herself couldn't possibly name. "Did you call the police on your mother?" she asked, emphasizing every word, as if hoping the repetition would make me repent. I was already too tired to soften my answer. "You hid Aunt Lillian's will and tried to sell something that didn't belong to you." Mom's head snapped up, her eyes shining, her cheeks flushed. "I cherished it," she almost screamed. I grieved. I laughed briefly, mirthlessly. "You've been grieving since I was born," I said, and her face twisted as if she'd been slapped. "You lived under my roof rent-free," she blurted out, and in that scream there was everything: wounded pride, old resentments, and that eternal "I gave you life." I exhaled. "I pay rent, remember? Or is your memory selective now? Are you accusing me of the privilege of being ignored?" She recoiled as if I'd struck her. Noemi, ever the noble mediator, stepped between us with that tired face of hers, where sympathy is always only theoretical. "You're distorting everything," she said softly. "It was temporary." I couldn't resist. "Temporary locks are unnecessary," Diego muttered from behind her. "That's ridiculous." I turned to him and said quietly, almost tenderly, "You should have stopped before the absurdity became a crime." My mother's hands began to tremble, her lips trembled, like those of someone caught naked in the cold. "Get out of my house," she said finally, her voice a mixture of command and plea. I met her gaze. "I wasn't planning on staying," I replied. "Packing took mere minutes. Most of my things were still in the bags from that night." As if life itself had been preparing for this escape, I grabbed Letitia's backpack, her tattered teddy bear with the crooked eye, and a couple of sweaters. Mom stood in the doorway, clutching a handkerchief, crying the way people only cry when there's an audience. Dad stood behind me, in the shadows, looking past me. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes," I said quietly, "I finally stopped letting you do this." That day, I picked Letitia up early from school. She ran out to me, bright and airy, her braids spilling over her shoulders, and with that carefree smile that children wear like armor. She got into the car, buckled up, and said, "Can we go somewhere fun?" I glanced at her in the rearview mirror and felt a lump rise in my throat. "Yes," I replied, "we're taking a little break." That night, we stayed with a friend, her small apartment with peeling walls and an old sofa whose springs sang with every movement. There was only one blanket, but the air there was lighter than in the entire huge house, where everything smelled of lies. When Letitia fell asleep, curled up in a ball, I sat in the dark, holding the phone in my hands, as if it were the only witness to my return to myself. The message from the lawyer arrived without fanfare, dry, businesslike. The police have opened a case. The probate hearing will be next week. The offer on Lillian's house is on hold. I read it twice before I allowed myself to exhale. It wasn't a victory, but movement, progress. The court hearing arrived faster than I expected. The courtroom was cold, filled with the smell of paper and dust, and everything in it was louder than it should have been. My mother appeared in black, as if she were burying someone again, and it was almost theatrical. Her lawyer spoke confidently, smoothly, insisting that there had been a mistake, a misunderstanding, that my mother was simply protecting the documents, that she was going to tell me everything, that her actions were merely an act of concern. The judge, a man with a stony face and tired eyes, listened without blinking. He flipped through papers, photographs, emails, and then words flashed on the screen that made even I, already prepared for anything, hold my breath. Beneficiary, Letizia Esposito. My mother's face turned pale. I saw fear flicker in her eyes, as if reality itself had betrayed her. The judge, without raising his head, pronounced calmly, like a sentence, Trustee Margaret Esposito is removed, Anna Esposito is appointed as trustee, the sale is declared void, all assets are returned to the trust of Letizia Esposito. My mother's lawyer, pale and with a damp forehead, mumbled something unintelligible, something like "we're appealing," but his voice was already uncertain, as if he didn't believe his own words. The judge didn't even look up, continuing to leaf through the documents as if there was nothing human in them. Only letters and facts. You can try, he said calmly, almost wearily, but the facts are clear. The words sounded like the final blow of a gavel, even though it hadn't yet hit the table. When we left the courthouse, the air seemed different, not just lighter, but cleaner, freer, as if the street itself had breathed a sigh of relief along with me. The lawyer walked alongside, holding a folder of papers like a shield. The district attorney will now handle the criminal case, he said quietly, trying to sound casual. Expect to hear from him soon. I nodded. What will happen to them? I asked, less out of curiosity than because I needed some closure. Most likely, probation, community service, restitution, first-time offenders, but the property judgment is permanent. They've lost the estate forever. He paused, then added softly, with a kind of awkward warmth, you did the right thing. I laughed briefly, harshly, as if choking on air. It's strange to do the right thing in this family, I said, and the laugh echoed inside, somewhere between relief and bitterness. 6 months passed. The dust, as promised, had settled, both literally and figuratively. I still caught myself listening to the silence, the way I used to listen to anxiety. Letitia now walks almost without a trace of her former limp, only in the mornings, on particularly cold days, is there a slight trace in her gait, a reminder of how dearly we paid for this freedom. Her doctor smiles every time he looks at us and says the progress is excellent, that another year of therapy and everything will be restored. This time, the word therapy doesn't make me grab my phone and check my bank account. We can afford to be cared for because we now have the right to peace. We live in Aunt Lillian's house. Her faint scent still lingers here, a mixture of rosewood, old polish, and something barely perceptible, like the memory of past conversations. Sometimes I feel like she's still here, watching, warming this house from the inside. There's no feeling here of tiptoeing, of any word potentially detonating. You can breathe here, you can live. A lawyer once brought in a final inventory of the property, blatant figures that reflected years of lies and struggle. The total value was just over $52,700. The house was valued at $434,200. The antique furniture was $43,500. The cash was $25,000. All of this is now in Letitia's trust. She is the heir not only to the money, but also to a chance to start a life free from the shadows that have haunted the women in our family for too long. The criminal case was dismissed last month. Mom pleaded guilty to trust fraud and theft by conversion. She was given 2 years probation, 500 hours of community service, ordered to pay restitution, and permanently disqualified from being a trustee. Dad, Noemi, and Diego received their sentences, aiding and abetting, 200 hours of community service, and probation. Nothing tragic, but enough to draw a line under the sand. In small towns, news travels faster than the smell of fresh bread. Everyone knows. They say they've seen Mom on the highway, in an orange vest, holding a trash bag. In the blazing sun, someone saw Noemi at the food bank, pretending to dedicate herself to charity. Diego stopped showing up at the golf club after someone taped a copy of the local newspaper to his locker. People who used to wave at them now cross the street. Awkwardness has become the new language. And we live, just live. Letitia quickly adjusted to her new school, made friends, draws with chalk on the driveway, creating entire cities out of colored lines, and in the evenings she helps me plant plants whose names we both confuse but still call beautiful. Sometimes, when I look at her, I realize the house has finally stopped being a battlefield. It's quiet here, in that good, human sense of silence where you can hear your own heart. The doctor says her leg will be as strong as ever. I believe him. So if someone asked if it was all worth it, the tears, the breakups, the loneliness, I'd probably say yes, it was. Because for the first time in my life, I feel like I did the right thing, and this feeling doesn't require justification, doesn't seek witnesses, it simply lives with me in this house, where the mornings now smell of coffee and new life.